we are actually 3 minutes behind. So with your permission of all the panelists and those people who are listening as audience, welcome back to our series of webinars on climate change and disinformation. My name is Panu Nipain, and I work at UNESCO's CI sector and manage ICT and sciences and open access programs. Together with our partner from IPS Academy Citizens Platform, Riccardo Grassi, I will be moderating the panel today. In the previous webinar, we had invited eminent experts to discuss how they have observed false information about climate change in their different fields and its negative effects in different aspects of our lives. Our experts have also shared some insights on the causes of this false information and how they think it can be addressed. One of the prominent issues that emerged from that discussion, which one of the audience had asked us, how the growing mistrust in science and the skepticism, or for that matter, extreme view of climate change is growing amongst both who produce and those who consume science of climate change. In this webinar and in the next one, we will be discussing this very issue. We will be examining some potential solution to the problem of false information about climate change using the framework of demand and supply side solutions. Today's webinar will primarily focus on demand side solution, which will work on the users of disinformation to help them be more careful and critical of the information that they use and weed out false information. So Friday's webinar will focus on the supply side solution, which work on the producer of information. Today, we are essentially like addressing information that how it is consumed by people. So without further ado, I will in fact pass the microphone on to Riccardo to introduce our panel and ask a couple of common questions. Riccardo, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Panu. So I'm Riccardo Grassi. I'm the president of IPS Academy, which is partnering with UNESCO in the organization of these webinars and further on. And I'm the Director General of the Citizens Platform on Climate Change and a Sustainable World, which will be presented in the webinar coming next Monday, 22. So our panel today, this is the second webinar, is comprised of a science communicator, representatives from organizations taking action against false information in the field of climate change, and climate activists. These experts know what needs to be done to be vigilant when using information on climate change and how to channel science, how to communicate science. But before we begin the discussion, I would like to invite our audience members, which are quite a few today, I mean, numerous, to post any question you have in the question and answer section as the discussion goes on. Please indicate to whom you would like to pose your question, and so our team will be monitoring the chat, and at the end of the panel discussion there will be a question and answer session where we will ask the panelists to respond to a selection of what you would like to know. So to begin, I invite our panelists to share some strategies that can be utilized to combat disinformation from the demand side. How can ordinary citizens be better informed and empowered in the fight against climate change disinformation? What are the key messages that the general public needs to understand about climate change? To you, panelists, each one is invited to provide the response in 8 minutes or under, please. We want to remain in the allocated time. So, to start with, I have the pleasure to invite Dr. Asher Means to start speaking. Asher is the Executive Director of the Tyndall Center for Climate Change Research, which exists since the last 20 years in the UK. He's a professional science communicator, so that's his subject and his expertise. And he's specializing in engaging audiences outside of academia with environmental research, including policymakers, public, media, and business. His university career has spanned the world-class institutes such as the Center for Population Biology at the Imperial College, has that name, Imperial College, and the Environmental Change Institute at Oxford University. So, Asha, please, your 8 minutes start.
Thank you very much, Ricardo, and thank you to the Citizens Platform and to UNESCO for the invitation. And hello to the viewers and listeners out there. So on strategies to combat misinformation about climate change, I mean, first of all, before we beat each other up, I think we should really note that the communication of climate change has been vastly successful. You know, look, we're all here talking about climate change. There's climate change news and information all around the world. And 20 years ago, when I started out in this field, that wasn't the case. So in Europe, for example, I'm a data-driven person, so I can only ever give evidence. Yeah, we're in the 80% of people concerned about climate change, actually worried about climate change, and worry is actually the word used when they're interviewed. And even just recently, in April, in the UK, you know, the height of pandemic lockdown, 66% of people in the UK still thought that climate change was of equal concern as COVID. So quite clearly we have done, or we being sort of a collective of people randomly involved in climate change communication without any central coordinating hub or anything like that, have been, you know, vastly successful. There's the Paris Agreement of 2015. There's climate change acts around various countries. I can see the rise of renewable electricity in the annual assessment of the global carbon budget, which is one of the things we do, how much CO2 has gone into the atmosphere. Nothing I've just said was true 20 years ago. And, you know, so the change is significant. And what are the biggest risks of disinformation? I think it's, for me, working within scientific institutions. Ricardo just did a very nice job of sort of listing the organizations I've worked for. And it's the erosion of trust in institutions. Information and dissemination is all about trust. Do we trust the source of where that came from? And that's bigger than anything else. And in terms of people making sense of information, do they trust where it came from? And what misinformation does, and disinformation, really, it challenges that trust and it erodes that trust in the source of information, that value. And it's even been shown in research that people who don't believe disinformation are still influenced by the fact that they saw the disinformation. So strategy number one is don't disseminate, don't amplify misinformation or disinformation. People do it all the time on Twitter and Facebook and social media. You know, their algorithms absolutely are designed to be clickbait to get people to amplify. So if somebody says something stupid or something you know isn't true, do not respond by saying, oh, this person spoke a load of untruths, this isn't the case. Just ignore it. Do not give the oxygen of publicity on a very personal level to your friends who are just wanting to check their Twitter feed over the coffee in the morning. They don't need this sort of doom coming into their feeds. And my next set of strategies will really be taking responsibility for how you are heard, and not amplifying misinformation and disinformation comes into that. Now, the first one is pay attention to cognitive bias. Cognitive bias is us accumulating information all the time that supports our worldview and our self-perception. It's all the media we read, we listen to, the people we follow on social media, the music we listen to, and even the bars that we go to. I don't know if anybody remembers bars. I'm very thirsty. And psychological distance. So that climate change, the narrative for climate change is mostly it's happening a long time in the future, far in a country far away to somebody you will ever meet. Well, that's not really true. It's happening now. It's the here and now. So pay attention to psychological distance, that it's not just a future problem, it's an issue now. And of course, the co-benefits of clean air, clean energy, green jobs are for the now as well as for the future. And my last one there is about embracing values. Values are what drives us all, our universal values, the beliefs we hold to our heart, and everybody underestimates everybody else in terms of their motivations. And what I mean here is we know from research that most people have self-transcending values around environmental protection, justice, equity, equality. But we think that everybody else is only driven by power and wealth. Yeah, and in fact, by tying to the values that people are aware of, that people do hold to their hearts, which is effectively environmental values, we do a much better job than appealing with our messages and our information to around sort of power and wealth and competition. And there's quite a lot to that, but just think of people's values when we're engaging with them. And you can check that out. It's a guy called Shalom Schwartz. These universal values have been tested in 90-something countries now, and they hold true in all of the countries where it's tested. So these self-transcending values are universal. Don't underestimate your audience. And I think maybe I'll finish there. That was four things to be thinking about in terms of our strategies.
I have to unmute myself, I remember. Well, thank you very much for this first intervention, Asha, which is very clear and with a kind of roadmap, no? I mean, good advice. I remember, and just to comment a couple of things, no? I mean, on one side, contrary to what you said, I read a study that's in the United States 1.5 years ago, more or less, underlining the importance of reacting against false information. I mean, to destructure it, to destroy, no? Then the other thing, and you could comment on this afterwards, and the other thing I remember when I heard you talking about the narrative on climate change that happens in the future, I remember a meeting organized by the Tyndall Center where the conversation was about making the difference between something urgent and an emergency, which is for me an important conceptual definition that has an impact on our way of doing things. And on this, the experience now with the COVID-19 is very interesting, which is clearly perceived as an emergency, no? Okay, let's leave it there. And I would like now to move to Emmanuel Vincent. He's the president of an important science feedback association, that is helping platforms like Facebook, Google, YouTube, and media, which act as gatekeepers of online information to promote credible sources of information, which is a fundamental thing. I mean, we can curb this information through reliable and accurate sources. Emmanuel has a PhD on climate science from the University Pierre et Marie. He's French, and completed a postdoctoral fellowship at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, but we all know MIT. Yeah, it sounds like that. So, Emmanuel, please tell us. You have 8 minutes from now.
Thank you very much. So thanks for the introduction. And I've shared a little link in the chat. So please check it if you want. I want to share my screen and show you a couple of visuals, and you can access the presentation at the same time. So I'm just sharing my screen now so you can see that presentation. And as the Dr. Means just said, one of the important things is to not promote and propagate misinformation by engaging with it, even though I agree we need to debunk it, which is different. So one of the things that I would recommend is having in mind some resources like the ones I'm showing on my screen, and I hope you all see it, that you can use to check the reliability of a source. So there are many kind of products, and they are still in progress, but I think the News Guard has made a good first iteration, and it's a Chrome extension that you can recommend people installing their browser. So if they arrive on a website that is of low credibility, they would see a little red flag. So that's just one tool that you can use to, just in case you arrive on a website that you don't know, that is pretty popular, they might have reviewed it with the transparent criteria. Another tool that is quite similar is media bias fact check. So it's quite important, I think, also to always understand the kind of partisanship of websites. That's increasingly what is driving misinformation about climate change. Is the polarization some, especially in the US, a political party adopt as a policy to be skeptics about the reality of climate change. And if you can find the fact checker's website. So in the case of climate change, I think we are the only one really checking climate change information. But if you use this link here, factualsearch.news, you can search reliable sources. So if you have a question about a news topic, then it would be a little bit better than Google in the sense that it will filter out potentially unreliable news source. So for climate feedback, so that is the website I created as a climate scientist, even though now I'm leading this institution called Science Feedback. And the concept was to offer the possibility for scientists to review the credibility of content and help the public, journalists, but also platforms to take this credibility of information into account. And I won't dive into the details of how to check a scientist expert, that a scientist is an expert, but I leave the methodology we are using here to check the publications and the quality of the publication of that person. And so you can, whenever you have a topic that is viral on climate change, I would invite you to check the website, Climate Feedback, and we have reviews of articles that are very viral, popular, or claims, and also insights where we explain more in depth about a given topic. And this is an example of an article review where we invite scientists to comment on an article and also provide a credibility rating so that you would know right away if it's credible or not. Now I've listed also a couple resources, either from the Climate Feedback website, like this first one, which is an in-depth investigation about tree planting as a climate solution. Is it actually useful to plant trees? If you read the media, you might find that some news outlets say it's a fantastic solution. Some say it's worse than doing nothing. So we always try to have scientists weighing, and I think it's useful to be clear on these kind of topics. And also to not yourself have weak arguments. So I think that's also very important, to not put in on the balance some weak arguments. Like another example is this Planet of the Humans movie from Michael Moore. And even though it comes from someone who is more on the environmentalist side, it's also full of inaccuracies. And I invite you to check the review, because it's misinformation that comes from a place where we would not expect it coming from. And finally, the last resource I would recommend publicizing is this Drawdown Project that is listing the solutions to climate change, and it can be sometimes counterintuitive. So for instance, you can go to their website and see a quantification of how useful it is to do different things. So for instance, they list like installing wind turbines and basically changing energy systems, reducing food waste as the most efficient ways to tackle climate change. But there is also, for instance, health and education, like promoting education in countries where otherwise women, for instance, would not have a job and could have more children that they would choose to have. So that's surprisingly one of the best climate solutions. It's to educate women around the world. And if I still have a little bit of time, I just want to mention now the fact that fact checkers also have a partnership with Facebook, some of them, and we have a partnership with them, so that when we review an article and determine that it's false information, then we can go on Facebook and mark the posts so that people would be notified and the virality of these pieces of information is decreased on the Facebook platform. So you can see an example here about an article on vaccines, but if you click, you have an example on climate change. And I'm just showing it here on my screen. So for instance, here was a video from PragerU. So it sounds like a university, but it's actually not. And we have reviewed this content. So Facebook shows that this is false information and people can see why it's false based on the fact check before seeing the video and deciding to share it. Okay, so that's it for now. And yeah, I'll be happy to answer questions if you have any. Oh, we cannot hear you, Ricardo. I see you're speaking.
But sometimes it's an advantage not to hear me. But so, no, in 1 minute, because you have 1 minute more, could you just briefly tell us about the impact of your initiative? I mean, in terms of users and feedback.
Yeah, so a lot of the feedback we receive from readers, because they are the ones, on Facebook at least, they are the ones who have seen misinformation. So very often they are not happy to be corrected. So I can say that a lot of the people are reacting by first rejecting, even though we also have a lot of people saying, oh, thanks, I didn't know, I shared this video because somebody else shared it with me and I didn't really know, so thank you for the feedback. So we do have this kind of interactions. Now we also have, we try to also encourage the journalists, if it's from a journalist that the content is coming, to correct their article, and it's increasingly working. At the beginning, it was very hard to, explain to journalists saying this is misinformation, but this is also helping the fact that Facebook takes action. So they understand that it's better for their own image to correct the content. So not leaving this false flag on their.
Good. Thank you very much, Emmanuel. It's very interesting and very needed, very much needed. And then this combination that you have considered, which coincides with the motto of this initiative, and which is the motto of Citizens Platform, which is beyond confusion, which means clarifying things, moving away the misinformation, fake news, etc., and inspiring action, which is showing what is being done, what could be done. I mean, examples, and stories. Thank you. You will talk more later. Some questions. Now, I would like to move to Mr. Najib Bashiri, who is with us from Morocco, his native country. And there, he is a founder of one of the first Moroccan associations for the environment. Human and Environment, that's the name, which aims to convince local authorities to develop policies against climate change. Mr. Bashiri has also engaged in environmental education, conducting courses about climate change and its effects on wetlands with the World Wide Foundation, and working with vulnerable communities, such as women in rural areas. So he has been collecting a lot of experience and know-how, and now I would like that you share some of that with us and our audience today. You have to unmute yourself. No, we can't hear you. There's a but let me see.
Now,
okay.
Now you can hear me.
Yes, good. So
Okay, yeah.
I mute.
Okay, thank you, Ricardo, and I'm really happy to be here with you and with some experts that, in fact, introduce me straight into the right information, because now we're talking about, misinformation and information, because as an activist in the field of the environment, we have to really collect a lot of, information to at least, convince our, environment communities and our political decision makers. And Mince, has been really right, because when we get misinformation and we try really to analyze it and respond to it, then we are just reinforce it. We are just give it more, power, and the best way is to neglect it, totally. And as you know, here, like, we are in a very critical and, a very fragile environment. And when I say here, I mean the Arab world, because, we are on the front line, we are the countries that are going to be badly, impacted, in terms of climate change. And what is paradoxical, sometimes, we are also responsible, some of the Arab countries are responsible for this situation we are in. And at the same time, we are victims, of, what we really produce. And in terms of, misinformation, we have been really involved in the environment and how to come out, with some feasible, solution. It is really hard, to work in an environment that most of the population is illiterate, and most of their, information sources, come sometimes from superstition. It is a question of, our daily behavior, because, like, for example, just I give you an example of COVID-19. When it started, many people, linked that, to, wrath of God, to some, religious, give it a religious answer, because we are not, some good citizen. God, has been really angry with us, so he has sent us, COVID-19. And the same thing, with climate change. Because you say, oh, our behavior is not the exact and the right, behavior that, we should have. And, God, has been really angry, not happy, with us as, some believers. And here, in fact, it's funny, we have climate believers and climate, atheists. And I don't know exactly where, we can, put ourselves, here. But, misinformation, we try not to correct it, but, trying to find different, information, venues in information, right information ways, to really convince, people that what we see right now is not a drought. It's a climate change, which is totally related, to our daily, way of living. And we always try, to come near the communities that, have been really badly impacted, by the climate change, and try to just, tell them to tell us exactly how they behaved, like, 20 years ago. And compare, the climate they had, 20 years ago with the climate, they are having now. And then that, can really sometimes, help to at least have an idea that there is a change in our climate. There is a change in our climate. Trying to tell them, to give us, some trees, plants, animals that they saw 20 years ago, and if they are still here, some of them say, oh no, yes, we in the past, we used to see this, we used to see, this, plant, this bird, this animal, but now they don't exist. And we try to tell them exactly why, what is the reason. And this is the only way, just, to make them face, the reality of climate change. Because, sometimes when we approach them, with some scientific evidence, and as they are illiterate, and, scientific evidence sometimes rely too much on details, and the more details we give them, the more, widely open the door is, to doubt. And so when they doubt, that is very problematic. We try to avoid, doubt, and especially when we give, some information. As we say, the devil, is in the details. So it's like, and science is a lot of details, and details, sometimes, can be used as a weapon against, evidence, against evidence. So, this misinformation. So as Min said, if we give it more importance, we try to really analyze it. It's like, giving oxygen, to it, and really expand it. What you really need right now, we need a climate, vaccination. We need a climate, vaccination that may, really help us not stop, the impact of climate change, but at least, to reduce, the impact. And if we take AIDS, for example, when AIDS, started in South Africa, and how people rejected, vaccinations, and it was too late when they really accepted a solution. When the death toll, reached like, more than 300,000 dead people, and then, it was too late. It was too late really to stop, that, health problem. So the same thing, here with the climate change. It's like in 20 years ago when we talked about climate change, Mince, was right. They always linked out, said that's the future. It's not going to happen. And 20 years now we are here, and it is really happening. It is really happening. And in Africa, we are not gas, emitting, countries, but we are, receiving the impact. We are receiving the impact. And to correct, as I said before, to correct, this superstition, views and approaches, sometimes we rely on some religious script, and just, show them that, the climate change is not something new. It's an old, natural, process. But the only difference between climate change of today and climate change, 6,000 years ago, is different, because it's accelerating, and the humans are behind this speed, which is really going up and up and up, and we have to find a mechanism and a tool to really reduce the speed. The speed is there. The speed is there. So, like, for example, here where I live, if you go back to what really happened 12,000 years ago, I think we had to walk into the beach, like most, about more than 10 kilometers to get to the beach. And then 6,000 years, from there, there was a sea level, and the beach, was really like, near the mountain, near the mountain. And now, again, 3,000 years ago, the beach is where it was, before. So they have to know this, because our really behavior, accelerate our way of living, has given more, oxygen, to the climate change, to really speed up and get to us very quickly. And superstition, we have, like in the Quran, for example. In the Quran, sometimes, people do not see what is there, but just, misinterpret, some verses and say, oh, it's our behavior. No. Like, Noah, deluge, it is, part of the climate change, when the sea level, rised and God, asked the prophet to collect, like couple from different, the biodiversity, systems to protect, our, planet, and that was, an example of really climate change that happened during Noah at the time. So sometimes we can use really religious approaches to really convince people that this has nothing to do with our daily behavior, and whether we are going to anger God or whether going to satisfy him. But this is nature. This is nature, and nature is totally dependent on our behavior, And the vulnerable, we work a lot, with the vulnerable, communities, and especially, with women in rural areas. Yes.
I will need to ask you you will have time to tell us more a little bit later, because otherwise it becomes complicated. No, excuse me.
Okay.
Very much shukran. Yes.
You're welcome. Yeah.
Yes. And before giving back the floor to my dear friend Banu, I just wanted to mention a couple of things that I consider very important of what you have said. One is the fact that an enormous part of the world is a victim of the climate change, which is produced or determined mainly by other part of the world. And the other extremely important thing, because it's directly related to how to communicate, is the local reality, which is made of local factors today, but then local history, religion, 3,000 years back, as you were saying, etc., which then makes us to reflect on how we communicate and how we produce information that then is going to arrive to someone in a certain place, and that then would be able to establish a connection between his or her personal life and what is being informed or commented to them. I would like that then later we reflect a little bit more about this and the concepts of adaptation and resilience, for instance. No? So, Banu, doctor, now it's your turn again. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. In fact, thank you so much, Ricardo, for giving me this this opportunity to welcome Vanessa Nakate, who she's with us. She's a youth climate change activist from Uganda. And she was the first to protest outside the gates of Parliament of Uganda in January 2019, and gathered other youth to draw attention to the plight of Congolian rainforest. Subsequently, she founded the Youth for Future Africa and the Africa-based Rise Up movement. So, Vanessa, you've got about 8 minutes to make your pitch, and I'll come back to you for more questions.
Well, thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. I'm a climate activist from Uganda, and I've been doing activism for over a year now. And as a climate activist, it's very important for people to receive the right information when it comes to climate change, to receive the right facts when it comes to climate change. And I'll share some of the ways that we can ensure that people get the right information about the climate crisis. One of the
You muted yourself. Thank you.
Sorry. One of the first ways is education. I come from a country whereby very few people understand what climate change really means. So they will not even know if the information that they're reading is true or not. So they have to first understand what the climate crisis really is and what brings about climate change and the impacts that are followed by climate change. So I think it is important to ensure education of different people about the climate crisis, because at this point, many people don't even know about its existence. So how will they be able to understand whether the facts are true or not, yet they have no clue about what climate change really is? So we need to go back to the basics and teach the people and reach out in schools and educate everyone to understand the issue of climate change and how it affects people's livelihoods. And then the other way is to go to the grassroots. Many times we see journalists, they talk about activism in other countries or how the people are impacted in other countries. And it's sad to see that most of the times they reach out to people who are not even in those countries. So those people just give estimated information. But then it would be great to see the journalists go to the roots, to the actual roots, to the ground, and see what is happening in those areas and interview the people in those areas so that they get first-hand information. Because when it comes to climate change, there is no room for second-hand information. We need first-hand information from the communities that are affected the most. If a hurricane hits a place maybe like Mozambique, like what happened in 2019, the typhoon the cyclone, in 2019, and the floods in East Africa, go to those places, reach out to the people in those places and get the actual information from those people. That will enable you to get the right information that you will spread on the internet. Because before you actually spread information on the internet, you have to first collect it. So we need more first-hand information in the fight against climate change and the fight against disinformation. And then this also goes to the internet users on different social media platforms. We need to examine the news sources that we follow. We need to examine the sources of information that we look up to, because we have seen some of the news sources, they give very authentic information about the facts of climate change, about communities or countries that are being affected by climate change, about the investments in the fossil fuel industries. So we need to ensure that the news sources that we are following are actually giving the right information, because by the time you share information, you've got it from a source. So now is the time to scrutinize the sources of information of climate change, because we can only share it if it's from the right source. So you have to examine and check the sources and see that every source where you get information is authentic enough. And then the other thing, we would love to see more projects of reporting about the communities that are affected the most. I had already talked about this, but let me bring it back again, because it is one thing to interview the activists, because most of them, they will talk about what they have seen in the news or what they have heard in the news, but then they have not been affected directly. So going to the ground and interviewing those very people who have been hit by the floods, who have been hit by the droughts, who have been hit by the cyclones, will help get first-hand information about how people are affected. Many times, the information ends on people saying that maybe 10,000 people were displaced or 100 people were killed, but they never get to understand what follows after that disaster. How are those people's lives affected after the disaster? Do they have food to eat? Can the children still go back to school? I think it is very important not to just look at the primary effects of climate change, but also look at the secondary effects that follow after the primary effects. But we can only get these secondary effects by going to the roots of those communities, to those people that are affected the most, and bringing their stories to the table. And then the other thing is, when you notice and realize that the information that has been put on the internet is wrong, then don't engage in it. Because when you engage in it, the people who follow you are going to see that. The people who follow the ones who follow you, they're going to see that. Because the moment you share it, that means you're sharing it to literally a larger group of people. You may have like 1,000 followers, but if like 50 people retweet what you have engaged with, that means it's going to reach out to like 500,000 people. So do not engage information when you know that it's true. If it is possible, actually block that information, or even report the account that is spreading wrong information, because we cannot risk having wrong information in the fight against the greatest threat facing humanity right now. And then the last thing I would say is spread the right information, because many times we just stop at reading what has been given, what has been talked about, what the scientists are saying, but then we should normalize actually sharing that right information to our people, to our friends, and to our platforms, because when we share that right information, that means that we are helping more people have access to the correct information about the climate crisis. We need to share the correct and the right information from authentic sources as much as possible. Because if we embed the internet and how should I say, if we fill the internet with the right information, one way or another, we shall absorb the wrong information. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. That was very powerful and also quite punchy. And from your intervention, I in fact begin to understand if the climate is changing at a global scale, maybe its impact and the concerns are essentially felt at a very local scale. So I think maybe the beauty of a conversation like this should be to come up with something that will somehow bring this global concern and kind of merge it or sync it with the local concern. So maybe we need to have a localized, so global as well as local, localized view on information exchange or information transaction, to put it in context. So what I will do now is I will ask a few specific questions, and then this one what I will do is I will still request our audience members to send our panelists questions together with please use our Q&A function to do it. But please, try to be extremely brief in case, you want. And even if you do not, respond or, take up your question immediately, we will make sure that, your questions are somehow reflected in the ongoing series of webinars. So your question will somehow, tailor the session that we will organize on Friday, or, the concluding session on 22nd of June. So maybe this time, I would like to reverse the order and give youth a chance to respond to a very specific, question. Given the fact that, youth today are gatekeepers of climate change information or false information, what do you think needs to be done to better inform youth to be the gatekeepers of false information? What can be done, given the fact that you are the group of people who are most savvy in terms of social media? You are, in fact, like you are the people. You meaning like youth people in general. You're the one who are kind of tweeting or sharing information on Facebook and other type of social media all the time. So what type of responsibility do you think the youth today has to deal with like, you know, to act as a gatekeeper in stopping, you know, spread of false information. So if you have got any insight, maybe you can say that, and if you have got some example, that would be extremely useful. Vanessa, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you for that question. Of course, the youth play a very important role in spreading this information, because you find that a very large percentage of young people is using social media. In my country, it's usually maybe 18 years and above, but I've seen it's kind of different when it comes to Western countries. You find that a 12-year-old is also on social media. Maybe the parents are helping out and managing their account. So the youth need to ensure that the information that they share on their social media is authentic. But then the youth need to first understand the kind of, I should say, the kind of niche that they are working on, if I'm to bring it in that way, because you find that not every youth is a climate activist. Not every youth is doing climate activism. You find that some are doing just human rights activism specifically. Someone else is doing preventing gun violence activism. So the youth need to engage with the right sources that give the right information in regards to the kind of activism that they are working on. For example, if I'm a climate activist, then I should follow authentic sources of the scientists on social media, authentic news sources that give the right climate information on social media. I would give an example, Guardian. The Guardian is one of them, and I really appreciate how much they talk about everything about the climate crisis, talking about the investments in the fossil fuel industry. So I would recommend any youth activist to follow the Guardian and follow up every information that they always put, because at the end of the day, it is authentic information. So you look at the activism that you are working on, the problem that you're trying to solve, and then surround yourself with a circle of people that are giving the right information in regards to your activism. If it is climate activism, get yourself following scientists, get yourself following youth leaders in the climate movement and learn from them. Get yourself following news sources that are giving climate information, like on a daily or on a weekly basis. If you are a gun violence activist, get yourself involved in people who are, fighting against gun violence as a specific kind of problem. So that is one of the ways to ensure that the right information goes out there. You have to first surround yourself with the people who are working towards the same goal that you're trying to achieve, so that you can get the information that they are giving out, that you can share their information, that they can also get information from you which is right, and also share it, so that we can ensure continuous spread of the right information regardless of the activism that you're carrying out.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. That was very nice. And because of young activists and young people like yourself, UNESCO had just launched a dedicated youth-centered program, which is aptly titled as You Can. I hope you and your network will consider to become a part of it if you are not already. And we also have another network of universities and campuses called Smart Campus Cloud Network, which helps university students to somehow get involved in climate activism, and also make them SDG ready, we call them. So I hope that if you or any other audience members like to have more information on this one, please write to us and we will provide you with this thing. Now I turn to Dr. Mintz. I hope he's there. I see that his video is switched off. He's there. So just a very straight question, Dr. Mintz. Effective climate action is a multi-stakeholder process. It requires many stakeholders to become a part and parcel of the movement. If this is true, who do you think should receive the climate information? Should it be the general public, receiving climate change information, or it's the policymakers? And to what extent, the information that policymakers or public, receive are reliable? And how do you ensure that?
I think that's a very good question. For me, possibly, it's got to do with resources in some ways, because the audiences for climate change information are absolutely vast. Can't possibly keep up with it. And that's why initiatives like the Citizens Platform, the other people speaking today, people in the audience, all of which are engaged with and communicating or talking about climate change in some way, it's so important is to have these partnerships that we can reach and engage with as many audiences as possible, and also for those audiences to engage with us. Information communication is a two-way flow of information. It's not just sender receiver dissemination from the scientist or the institution out to the public or the policymaker. It's a dialogue between, and that's how you do effective communication. Clearly, a lot of communication is one way and has to be one way, but really we're seeking dialogue as the best way to engage. But I think I think it would just have to be both, really, because both audiences, public and policy, have different information requirements in terms of perhaps the technical level of information. The information will be tailored to whether it supports perhaps policymaker policies or goes against policymaker policies. But in some ways, although the technical level might be different, the actual information itself is probably the same. So in some ways, it's the way we tell the story, disseminate the information, is different, but the story will be roughly the same. And of course, as we've heard from the other speakers, actually, in particular Vanessa and Najib, about different approaches to different audiences, where depending where they are in the world, local context to stories, local voices talking about what's happening in their location, what they see is happening, or what they think's going to happen. And I think that's the same whether you're public or policy. Whether going back to that trust, you trust the voices that you know and you trust, which is coming right back to the misinformation. So I do think target both different information but the same information, but again definitely pay attention to psychological distance, values, and cognitive bias.
Thank you so much. I think your last sentence essentially summarizes it very, very, very nicely, and I think that is also will be a take-home message for everyone who's attending this webinar. What I will do now is I'll ask Emmanuel Vincent a very straightforward question. You say that okay, your science feedback is extremely useful platform, and it's in fact empowering users of the internet to have access to scientifically sound and trustworthy information. But I must play a devil's advocate here. There are equally a similar number, or maybe more, portal channels and then message producers out there who are spreading wrong information. So how do you ensure that your accurate information stands out against the vast inaccurate information that is spreading on the internet? So maybe provide us, something, very, very, very concrete and take home, that we can utilize for this program to develop in the longer run.
So in our case, we need to rely on partnerships. That's really what we have to do because we are a small organization. So we need to gain the trust of organizations that have more kind of power to disseminate information. So for instance, I illustrated this with the partnership we have with Facebook. So even though, for instance, the PragerU institution, they have billions of dollars in their pocket, right? They push information that is very often false information. They push it on YouTube, they push it on Facebook, and they have infinite amount of money virtually to send, to spend. So they can just pay so that people view the content. And I mean, it's very hard to imagine competing against that kind of money. So we adopted a different strategy. In this case, for instance, partnering with Facebook allows us to still show the fact check on top of the video. So the more they pay to have the video viewed, the more we actually get views on our website. So that's one kind of strategy. And we are also trying to work with other platforms like YouTube. And so what's very important in our strategy is that we don't necessarily just try to kind of reboot information or respond to the people, but more to improve the ecosystem of information online. So it's not just trying to flood the web with our own information, but more trying to help scientists identify the trustworthy sources so that then we can communicate that to the platforms. And when people go on Facebook, they will be less likely to see a false video to start with. When they go on Google, they will search for some information and the most trustworthy sources are at the top. So that's really the kind of strategy that we think is the most efficient. And with a small budget, otherwise you will need to spend a lot of money to become very good at search engine optimization, these kind of things. So yeah, so far that's our strategy.
Perfect. Thank you so much. That's really interesting. So now I turn to Mr. Bashiri. As a part of the fraternity of civil society organization, how does your organization identifies accurate information? Because you're one of the information user, quote unquote. How effective do you think is the civil society operates right now as the watchdog for the public as well as private sector in the field of climate change disinformation? You need to unmute yourself, sir. Oh.
Okay. I would like to thank Vanessa that has in fact talked about human rights organizations, and I remember in Morocco freedom of speech was kind of a threat sometimes to policymakers here, and in the beginning the organization never talked about many topics that in fact are now considered as human being right. Like for example, water. In the past, it was not. Most of the organization did not, put water as a human right in their agenda. Migration also it was totally absent. But with the contact with these organizations, we have come to at least an agreement, a consensus, where the human rights organization could also talk about climate change, talk about water, talk about because they have their audience and they are present everywhere. And now, like locally, we have our organizations of human rights talking about climate change. This is very important. Like we have to collaborate. We have to collaborate with different organization, though we sometimes believe do not share the same objective, the same interest. We are very lucky our association, our organization, because we are linked to different sources of information. different sources of information, and our being, part, of different, networks, working in the field of environment and also, climate change. So we get, our information from that, and then we distribute it. We try, to use information, to convince, at least locally, the communities, And right now, for example, we're working on local, project, where, most of the development agendas in Morocco, they do not include, a plan, an approach in climate change. They have to really adopt a new policy in climate change locally, because at national level, sometimes it doesn't work. Like NDCs, for example, is at the national level. But if we come down to local, with all the policy national policy, and bring it down, to the local, policy, I think that would be really a good answer, to many climate, problems, And we try also to bridge, the problem also is trust, in climate science. We have to really find a way to bring, the climate, science into the local, authorities, and use it as, of course, a way to adapt. One more important thing, because we haven't talked about education. We haven't talked about education, which is very important. And if we do not look at education as a sustainable education, where climate change is part of it, the curriculum, should also talk about, climate change. So if we take, curriculum here in Morocco, they are talking about climate change. Climate change is totally absent, from any program, educational program. And I think, right, the youth, Vanessa talked about the youth. Where are they? They are in education. We have to really introduce them, to this phenomena, of climate change. They are our voice, because I'm the only, I think, young person here is Vincent. We're talking to Vincent, but most of us, are older, and we cannot, in climate change right now, we cannot talk to older people about climate change. We talk about the youth that are our guarantee, to really promote, this climate change approach. The youth are very important, and they are our last, hope, and the right and exact solution to climate change. They are the alternatives, but if they have the right information,
Thank you.
The right information is very important.
So thank you so much. In fact, this has been a very, very, very engaging discussion thus far, and some of the point that you bring forward essentially provides me a very easy lead to bring in the audience question right now. So I'll ask my colleague Melissa to read out a couple of those questions. Some of these questions I think are they are keyed in the Q&A section. You can read out a few, and if some of the participants are also available, and if they wish to ask the question themselves, they I'm asking our technical person to allow if some of these persons could also be upgraded or given the mic to ask the question. So Melissa, first ask a couple of questions, and then we will go and open the discussion to a wider audience. Melissa, please.
Thanks, Banu. So we've got quite a number of questions from our audience. So I'll start with the few questions that we had, which are mostly, I think, for Emmanuel. So 2 questions. The first one, is there a resource that knows how much money is spent by corporations on climate change misinformation? That's the first question. And then a second question is that it seems that this information is really becoming more, is really proliferating more with the advance of technologies which can easily create and dispense this information. Are there any global responses to disinformation, such as AI utilization and cooperation across the border? So the first question is from Mr. Shahidul Alam, and the second question is from an anonymous person. Emmanuel, please.
Sorry. So for the first question, I've put a link as a response there to the, is there a resource that maps how much money is spent by corporations? So the answer, I think, is there are some resources, but they are incomplete because a lot of the money is kind of hidden and increasingly so. And there is one scientist called Drexel who has done this landmark study in 2013 that I shared in the Q&A response. I hope everybody can access that. And what has been shown also by this person is that increasingly the money is going through some kind of funds where you cannot really know who has put money in there and where the money goes after. So it's kind of a black box where the money goes in and out, but you don't really know what's happening. While in the past, it was more one company, maybe say Exxon, funding this specific think tank to produce videos that say climate change is not happening. It was a little bit more transparent. So I hope this resource is a good start for anyone investigating here. And I've noted other questions, but I'm not sure that's the one you said. I've seen a question from me in the chat about Twitter and whether the fact that Facebook and Twitter are now using these little flags on top of some tweets or some social media posts. And the question is that changing the situation? I think for Twitter especially, it's extremely small, it's very tiny. It's like they are just flagging one or two tweets here and there. So it's kind of symbolic. They just say, they take a stance and say, okay, we are going to put some messages of misinformation. And it's a little bit the same with Facebook, even though it's at a bigger scale, but it's also this approach that when there is one post that is false, then we put some fact check on it. And it's better than nothing. It helps inform people, and it's quite a big scale for Facebook. It's like tens of millions of these kind of notifications have been sent since the beginning of 2020. So it's tens of millions, but there are billions of posts every day, people interacting. So if they really want to change the landscape, I think they need to change the rules, the algorithm, how information is being shown to people. And especially look at the credibility of the sources. So if one Twitter account or one Facebook account has shared misinformation 10 or 20 times in the past, the only way to be efficient would be that these sources are less visible to all the users on the platform. Everything else is not going to change the problem. And so far, they have not done that. So they are doing something, but they are not changing the problem at its root.
Thank you. I think there is someone who is asking for the floor from the audience. We will entertain those as well. But if there are other people also who like to take the floor for some to ask a couple of questions, you please kindly raise your hand and we will give you the microphone. So right now I'm asking Melissa to ask another question to our panelists.
If I may. There was
just Ricardo, Melissa is just about to ask another question, and then you can come back. I'll come back to you.
Thank you, Banu. So actually, Emmanuel, the question, so you answered another question, which is great. There's an additional question which came later about how the advance of technology is affecting the phenomena of disinformation, because technologies can facilitate the creation and dissemination of disinformation. So this anonymous person would like to know if there are any global responses to disinformation using AI or using cooperation across borders. So please.
Yeah, so there are a lot of companies that are trying to use artificial intelligence, that mostly startups, that are trying to use artificial intelligence to fight against misinformation. So far, the ones that are failing is the ones that try to kind of identify misinformation based on the text. Say, identify if something is true or false. That's really too hard for any kind of artificial intelligence so far. But what can be done and by some companies is more looking at the networks when there is a piece of information, say on Facebook, and you can identify that it's being artificially boosted by different groups or different user profiles that are not real person. So one group I think is doing a great job on that. It's called Graphica. So it's a company in the US, and they are investigating networks And so it's not about the information itself. They don't check that, but they check who is spreading it. So Graphica is a great example, I think. In Europe, there is also a group called EU Against Disinformation. They are doing the same kind of things, trying to see if there is other states behind misinformation. It's not necessarily about climate change. And about technologies that are used to become more efficient in terms of spreading misinformation, I think what the companies do, it's kind of the very targeted marketing. There are companies that have enough money to run a lot of tests, so they can run a post with some words and change a little bit the words, so they can send a lot of tests to millions of people and see what works best. So if they change the wording one way or another, does it change your reaction? Does it change whether you want to vote for this or that person? And I think that's a technology that is used by misinformation sources, and that is quite dangerous because you can really kind of influence and maybe manipulate people with that by targeting the message so that you are not going to see the same message as I am going to see. Some companies are really powerful enough to have the money to run a lot of tests. Then maybe it's anecdotal, like, yeah.
No, Ricardo had a point to make, so I'm in fact giving him the floor right now.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. No, I wanted to comment something on this question about the global responses to disinformation, which is more or less the same question to which now Emmanuel has been referring regarding artificial intelligence. No, I mean, this global response is growing, I think. I mean, on one side you have institutions like UNESCO, concretely, which one of its main roles in the sector or intersectoral framework that moves forward to give an answer to that. And at the same time, we have from the civil society side, and this is something like the citizens platform that we are launching now, which is global. And but the central point is that we need to come together. No, as I mean, concretely, what Emmanuel is doing, we should engage and see how we empower each other. And same with other similar initiatives. We are already working together with Asher Means and the Tyndall Center. I mean, it's a matter of coordination, mutual empowerment, and to think about how to communicate properly, because this is a major point. I mean, communication is not just something like this. Communication requires a certain rules. And on this, the global, which I understand how it is used in this question, but the local, as Vanessa was underlining once and again, is fundamental. It's fundamental. And it's not easy to develop. It's part of the engagement to be able to develop local information that serves locally and that then at the same time is disseminated globally. It's not easy because it's costly, you see, and what happens, as Emmanuel was referring to, how much money are the corporations putting, this was Shahidul Alam's question, to develop this misinformation and disinformation and fake news. Well, those are the corporations. We are not corporations. And so we have to see how, through engaging, we gain the power that we need to develop, because financially things are not so simple, no? This is what I wanted to say. Just one thing, little thing, no, because I saw one of the comments there that there was only one woman in this webinar today, no? Which is a good observation. We had planned for exactly the same number of women and men, but then there were some inconveniences because of the time shift and this and that, and some of the female participants finally could not make it.
In fact, I would like to add, one more sentence on that one. This webinar is one of the 4 webinar, and it's in the series. And in the last webinar, there were more women than men. So, if we actually, take the number, it essentially balances out, because UNESCO is extremely concerned about, making it gender as well as, regional balance. So there are people from different parts of the world also, and not only people or persons belonging to different gender. So again, I go back to Melissa, if she has got another question to ask, or, if our Davide can give the floor to someone, who's asking for the floor.
Okay, so I have asked one of our audience members if they're willing to raise their questions, but as she's not responding, I'll read her question out for, I think she directed it to Mr. Bashari, but I believe that Vanessa could possibly answer this question. So the question is, some of the solutions to climate change and a lot of the issues related to climate change are very complex. And for example, solutions to climate change can have a positive impact in some areas, but the negative impact in other spheres. So for example, in the production of materials used to produce windmills is not taken into account when we when we account for the environmental impact. So all this sort of information is very complicated. How can we reliable sources of information while still making sure that the complexity is addressed, that ordinary people can still understand this information? So Mr. Bashari and possibly Vanessa, please.
Again, you have to unmute yourself first.
The question was not really clear. I couldn't hear you exactly.
Apologies. So the question from Julia is that a lot of information about climate change is very complicated. How can we promote reliable source of information and that are very complex, making sure that the people that we want to reach out to can understand this complex information?
Okay. Anyway, of course, we are a filter. We cannot really give, our community a crude, information. We have to filter it and bring it down, to that. There is always a consensus, bring it down, to their level of understanding. Because if we try to really, give them crude information, scientific information, and we know that, they are illiterate, they cannot really understand that. So we have, to come out, with a simple way to really help them, understand, this climate change, phenomena. And of course, when you talk to a layman, we are not going to use the same, information that, a scientist, have got. We have to really reduce it and adapt it, to their, climate environment. We cannot, talk about the impact of nuclear here in Morocco, and we don't have any nuclear, plant. So we have to talk about, what they know, they experience, things that they are really directly in contact with, and that the information should really at least understand, the ground where you are working. If you don't understand your ground, if you don't understand your environment, and you don't understand how people will respond to the information you are giving them, that's just a waste of time. We have to adapt, our information to the level of the community, and to their daily life. We cannot talk about, something which is very fictitious, and that can be totally, the opposite of what we are really aiming at. We want our information to be used and not rejected. And the only way to use, our information is to really adapt it to the local thinking, because the local thinking, is totally different from the national thinking. It's not the scientific, thinking. The local thinking sometimes is very limited, and we have to play on that. We have to know exactly how limited, our community is. We cannot go beyond the limit to give them an information that, may mislead them and deceive them. Misinformation, we don't want to play the role of misinformation. We are here about information, good information. We don't want to deceive our population with information that is too complicated.
Thank you so much. Will Vanessa give her perspective on this question, because it is quite interesting. How can we make things fit, or fit to purpose for at the local scale?
Thank you for that question. I think that the best way that we can make the information as simple as possible to the people in these communities is by bringing it to them in the language that they understand, because you find that many people don't even understand the connection between the fossil fuel industry and climate change. They don't understand 1.5 degrees Celsius. They don't know those things. Right. So you have to bring it to them in the language that they understand. I will give an example of a baby and an adult. You find that in one way or another, they all have access to the necessary nutrients that the body needs, but then they eat in different ways. A baby will consume that food in a different way, and an adult will consume that food in a different way. But at the end of it all, they're receiving the same nutrients, the same proteins or carbohydrates like within their bodies. So we have to find ways of bringing this information in the language that the people in these communities understand, but also involve them in some of the projects that we bring in these communities, maybe resilience projects. It is important to involve these the people in those communities, because you find that they understand their communities more, they understand the language that their people speak. You can engage with the chairman of those people, or the chiefs, or the local leaders in those places, involving them in resilience, so that when you take resilience to them, when you take that information to them, they don't feel like you are trying to take over their community, in that they'll be forced to try and defend themselves. So you have to involve them in whatever plans involving some of their leaders, so that the leaders extend the information to the other people, so that they understand that, yes, these people are here, they are helping us out. How are they helping us out? Maybe they are providing water tanks for water harvesting. You understand, we've been going through some dry seasons, and they're explaining it in this way, that we've been suffering these dry spells because of this, and they're here to give us this resilience. So welcome them. So I think that is one of the ways that we can bring this information and maybe resilience, bringing it in the language that they understand, and involving their leaders in running projects of resilience in their communities.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. I think we have received many questions, but I hope Asher can answer one of the questions that Melissa can read out. Melissa, can you please read out the question to Asher?
Sure. So this last question is because we've been talking so much about communicating to the public, but in terms of communicating to policymakers, what are the key messages? And we also know that policymakers communicate information as well to the public. So how can policymakers be an effective channel to assure the public that climate-related information is trustworthy? Thank you, Asha.
Thank you for the question, whoever sent the question. And another really good question. One of the important things about policy people, for right or wrong, comes back to what I was saying about trust in source, is that people do listen to policy people, and they do sort of follow their leaders, and they want to know what the thought leaders say. And so for that reason, policymakers are very influential communicators, even if they're saying things that we know not to be true. And we know who I'm speaking about. So the importance of those leaders, and Vanessa was just talking about community leaders, and it's exactly the same. It doesn't matter if you're the president of a continent or a community leader at a much more local level. People look to those trusted voices of authority for their information, and some reason quite usually believe them and do as they're asked to do. And then, so that's why policy people are important, because they are almost a leader of public thought, and the mix within that is, of course, journalism, because journalists themselves are often sort of just amplifying what it is that policy person said in a speech. You know, nobody would know what a policy person said in a speech if it wasn't very well covered by news networks, which then gets picked up on social media and circulated. But also there's the other direction of relationship as well, which is the public does influence policymakers as well, and perhaps some of the ways that works best, and just moving social media out for the minute, is perhaps through the newspapers, or the media, because policymakers really, all they really want, they want to be re-elected. They want people to think, the public to support them and think good of them, and so the policy people scour the newspapers and certainly the elected politicians to see what it is that the public is saying and thinking about them, if we assume that journalists sort of reflect public interest, and that's why an editor picks up a story, because she or he thinks it's of public interest. So they're all important, and I think we have to just engage with as many as possible. The policy people lead thought, and the public sort of lead thought in the policy arena as well.
Thank you so much. Mr. Bashiri, you'd like to, yes, please, the floor is yours. But, we're almost going to come to an end. So anyways, please, unmute yourself, because you're muted.
Yeah, just Vanessa and also raised a very important, point here. It's like when they talked about, the political leader, I think the first thing we have to do, we have to create, establish a sort of trust, ground of trust with the local leaders, because, if we don't do that, the political leader and the local leader always, thinks negatively, because, his or she's thinking of how to preserve, her or his state's political status. And, we have to avoid any political conflict, with the local leaders, because, it's their survival. And if they feel that, their survival is really menaced, then everything, will just, fall apart. And we have to really create this atmosphere of trust between us as activists and the local leaders. That's the only way to really, come to our objective. I remember when I started the project in a rural, community, one of the most people that resisted to the project was, the political leader there, because he thought that, my project would really, impact him badly, and then, in the running elections, he would not be elected. But at the end, he understood that, we had nothing to do, with politics. We are here to really help the community. So if the political leader, is really satisfied with what you are doing, I think he's a plus. He or she can also become a vehicle to transmit, our information, our message on climate change.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. That is, in fact, it's so engaging. This discussion is so engaging that I wish we had more time to discuss about it. But as I started, when I first started, I noted that this is one of the three more like webinars that we will be organizing, two more webinars that we will be organizing. So some of the questions we left unanswered, we will be taking it up in our next episode of this webinar on climate change disinformation. beyond confusion and inspiring action. And I hope that today we managed to at least contribute a little bit in clarifying some of the confusion around demand side of climate change disinformation. And also definitely with a person like Vanessa, she definitely inspired she definitely did inspire me, but I think her presence here actually contributed to many other people who got inspired to do something positively to fight against climate change disinformation. I would like to thank all the panelists which are there, and I would also like to thank my wonderful co-host and co-moderator Ricardo. If you have got any final things to speak about, please do. But after that, we'll wind up for the day, and we'll meet again on 19th of June at 2 p.m. again. So Ricardo, please, your last word, and then.
Thank you, Banu. So you're so kind, really. I want to thank each one. For me, this has been wonderful. I agree with Banu that Vanessa is much motivating and energizing, and at the same time, I mean, the inputs by what Emmanuel is doing, Asher's particular expertise in dealing with concrete communication initiatives, and Bashiri bringing the local dimension, which is fundamental, as it also underlined Vanessa. No, I mean, there's a tremendous unbalance regarding the flow of information. We get a lot of global information coming from one part of the world, and we don't get enough from the other part of the world, from where I also come, I mean, which is Latin America. And this has been an issue that goes on and on. And this imbalance is a major problem that we need to consider. I mean, we have access to some media which is doing the good things, I mean, mainstream media, but few of us have access to that. Very few read or receive in the web The Guardian, New York Times, Washington Post. I mean, we were talking with Asher about this. I mean, the difference between getting something published in a mainstream media, I mean, those we like, or publishing a column in The Sun, let's say, which is a popular daily newspaper. So, I mean, this is the point, how we gain more and more. And I think that the conversation today has been extremely useful for that. So we should continue interacting to build the things. So thank you.
Absolutely. So once again, we will, the next episode of this webinar series will be on 19th of June, again at 2 p.m. There are a lot of students who have joined, and they have in fact repeatedly asked us a question whether or not we will acknowledge their participation in the form of a certificate or something like that. We'll definitely provide you something. So do not worry about it. You can in fact spread the message and bring in more friends to join the webinar if
Yes.
they're interested. And we will see you again on 19th. So thank you so much.
If I may say about the 19th, there will be something unusual, no? I mean, among relevant panelists, we are going to have also a major advertisements agency, a major world advertisement agency.
Sure.
That have an environmental soul, and it would be, I think, extremely interesting to see their perspective. I
Absolutely.
mean, the advertisements, which is the producers, consumers, I mean, and what to do about climate change and environment in that context, and what could be done. Okay.
So thank you so much. Thank you all panelists. Thank you audience. You're super good. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.